Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kelly Timko. I'm from Galarath, and I'll be your moderator for this live learning event. Welcome to Black Swan Events, Measuring and Managing Risk for Rare Events and Economic Uncertainty, featuring Dr. Christian Smart. Thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to learn something new with us. All attendees have been placed on mute so we can avoid any background noise. However, if you have any questions or you need any help logging in or with technical things, you can use the chat function to speak with me. Today's session is brought to you by Galarath. Galarath is the creator of the SEER cost optimization platform that helps organizations view, analyze, and optimize agile and traditional project, cost, schedule, and risk scenarios and their outcomes. You can find us on the web at galarath.com. Please stick around for the live Q&A period at the end. This will be your opportunity to ask questions and to make the session relevant to you. We'll also be providing a link in the chat window to a 2-minute post-event survey. And on Thursday of next week, we'll be giving away a $100 Amazon gift certificate from the pool of survey respondents. So I want to be sure that you take time to fill that out. If you're from a government agency and aren't able to accept a gift certificate, then we're also happy to donate that amount to a local charity if you're selected. Also, if you know anyone else in your organization or on your team who should be joining us this morning, you can ask them to join us right now by sending them to galarath.live. That's GALORATH.live, L-I-V-E. As well, all the handouts from today's session, a PDF version of the PowerPoint deck, and also a video of the session when it's ready can also be found at galarath.live. Our next virtual lunch and learn is going to be in July, and we will be announcing that by email. You can also follow us at Galarath on social media channels, and you can see the announcement on those as well. Today's training is being recorded, and a video will be available for your later viewing, and we'll be sending the URL to all the registrants. And you may also feel free to share that video link with any of your colleagues. So let's get on for today. Today's presenter is Christian Smart, Chief Scientist of Galarath Federal. Dr. Smart has 20 years of experience with cost and schedule risk analysis, predictive analytics, probabilistic reliability analysis, and machine learning. His background in aerospace includes missile defense programs, nuclear thermal propulsion, hypersonics, and robotic and crewed space vehicles. Please hold your questions until the live Q&A session at the end, and we'll be sure that everyone's question does get answered. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Smart.
Thanks, Kelly. It's really, as the title mentions, we're going to talk about black swans, which are rare, high impact, and surprising events. We're also going to talk about there's a lot of things that you can measure. So the black swan events, it may be difficult to measure the uncertainty or assess the risk, but there are a lot of things that fall outside that category that you can. So we're talking about those as well. And there's a lot of material that we're going to go through today. This is a little bit about me. Kelly mentioned this already. We're going to go through a lot of material today. We're going to go through fairly quickly, but you don't have to take notes because you will have access, as Kelly mentioned, you will have access to recording of this material after the webinar. So, you may want to make, jot any questions you have and save them for the end because we'll be answering questions at the end. But don't need to make notes because this is being recorded and you will have access to the recording. In The Wizard of Oz, as Dorothy and the Scarecrow and the Tin Man are going through the forest, they talk about, they're going through the forest and they don't know what's in the forest. There's lots of uncertainty. So it could be lions and tigers and bears. So they start singing lions and tigers and bears on miles. So today we're going to talk about black swans and gray rhinos and dragon kings. This is the zoological metaphors for risk. The black swan is the most famous of these. There's also the gray rhino, which are things that you can see coming like you can in a rhinoceros. It's difficult not to see a rhinoceros coming, but it's easy to be fooled into complacency because the rhinoceros appears to be a slow moving animal, but once he starts moving, he can run 40 miles an hour. So once he starts running, you cannot run him. And then there's dragon kings, which are things that are even higher impact than are predicted by power laws, which is where a lot of the area of black swans comes into play. There are two dimensions to risk I like to talk about. One is the likelihood, which is how frequently does something occur, and the other is the consequence, which is the impact. And so these are two important things to distinguish. We tend to focus on the frequency of events occurring, not so much the likelihood. So the kind of risks we're talking about today that we're focusing on are things that don't occur very often, but they do have a high impact when they do. And we tend to we hold in a sense of complacency. We went 100 years without a major pandemic like the Spanish flu that occurred in over a century ago until COVID-19. So that kind of widespread pandemic, people were sort of lulled into complacency. Once it occurred, we weren't prepared for it. Some things that frequently occur are things like the constants and growth and schedule delays for aerospace projects, all kinds of projects actually. Not so frequent is major failure of a system, such as the explosion of a space shuttle, which occurred a couple of times in a few decades of its history. Very rare things like extreme cost growth, things that quintuple or sometimes increase by cost order of magnitude, and things like the number of deaths due to occurred during the wars. Low consequences, things like minor technical problems that may shut down a system for a day, and then we talked about the things that are high consequence, which are the major systems. They tend to occur fairly rarely, but they're high impact when they do occur. And so I like to talk about the distinction between frequency and consequence, because we tend to focus on those risks that occur frequently. And we need to pay more attention to the risks that occur rarely. Consequence is more important than frequency. One example of this is Pascal's wager. Mathematician Blaise Pascal wrote a few hundred years ago that a rational bettor and should bet on God's existence. Pascal was one of the developers of probability theory, and he did this based on it was inspired by gambling. He had some friends that were gamblers, and basically a gambling game was interrupted, and so to figure out what the payoff should be, he had calculated the probability that there were two people that were playing this gambling game. He calculated the probability that one player would win, the other player would lose, and then distributed the payoffs that way. So he also, being familiar with gambling, he wrote that a rational gambler should bet on the existence of God, because if he does exist and you believe he exists, that's good. If he doesn't exist, but you believe he exists, it's no big deal. On the other hand, if you don't believe and he doesn't exist, well, no big deal. But if he does exist and you don't believe he exists, then it could be bad. So need to focus on the consequence. Could be quite severe. Another more modern example is from Dirty Harry film that was released over 50 years ago now. It's hard to believe. Where Dirty Harry, there's a shootout that occurs during an attempted robbery, and Dirty Harry corners one of the robbers at sort of the end of the shootout, and the robber was within reach of his gun, and so he points the gun at him and he says, "I know what you're thinking. In all the excitement, did he fire? Did he fire 5 shots or did he fire 6? In which case, his gun would hold 6 bullets, so he'd be out of bullets." And he said, "Well, in all this excitement, I kind of forgot myself. But the question is, do you feel lucky, punk?" So he's pointing the gun at him. He says, "Do you feel lucky?" And the gunman the robber backs down, doesn't reach for his gun, surrenders, and then Dirty Harry then pulls the trigger to show that he actually out of bullets. So he really knew that he was out of bullets. He was bluffing, but the important thing is that the robber made the correct decision in the face of the potential consequence, which was that he could have had his head blown off by Dirty Harry's gun, which was a .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world at that time. And let's talk about types of randomness. There's a variety of different frequencies of randomness and a variety of different definitions. I'm breaking it down into just these 4. There's the things that we often deal with if you take in a statistics class. There's the mild and symmetric type of variations, which are things like health insurance, some maintenance costs, variation in the heights of humans. Then there's the things that we tend to deal with more often in the real world, but we may not be as prepared for by our education and our experience, are the mild to wild, the asymmetric risks, things that are skewed, things like part reliability, cost and schedule risks for up in aerospace programs, those kinds of risks. And then there's these are the things that are can be encapsulated or described by log normal distributions. For example, Then there's the wild risks, which are things like deaths from pandemics, destruction from terrorist attacks, financial impacts of hurricanes, stock market crashes, film revenue. These are really, you kind of look at the tail, the extremes of these, and these tend to follow a certain sort of pattern. And we'll talk about it in a little bit. And then there's some things that you just can't handle at all, and some things you just can't foresee. Who would have known 20 years ago, for example, that we'd all basically be carrying a smartphone? Almost all of us be carrying a smartphone in our pocket. And who realized that? I mean, that's an example of a uncertainty that was intractable that had a positive consequence. But there are other things that you just can't foresee. There's some things you just can't realize. Now, if you look at the Black Swan phenomenon and what's been written about that in the past, Nassim Taleb, he just says, he kind of tends to focus on this area. What I'm going to talk about in this presentation is there are a lot of ways to deal with some of these risks. They're not all in that area. There's a lot of risks that are the mild to wild, asymmetric, the wild risk. And that's what we're focusing on to a large extent here, that are outside that category. So Black Swan's been used to cover a lot of different things. There's a lot of things that are not Black Swans. You can model those. And even in the case you do have Black Swan events, there are things that you can do to be prepared for them. And some things we're going to talk about here are things that you can, dealing with risks, which are unknown unknowns and resource risk, extreme, how to deal with statistics of extremes, which the Black Swan type events tend to fall into. And then also talk about some causal modeling as a way to get around the problem of rare events and a lack of data. Things that occur very rarely, you don't have a lot of data on. So in that case, you need another tool set. And causal modeling, and also written there as the science of why, is all about that. And so the first one we'll talk about is the 3-parameter log normal for resource risk. That's the type of, a log normal is a type of distribution. We tend to systematically underestimate resource risk. And here's an example. This is the tethered satellite system, which was launched in the late 1980s. There was some initial risk analysis that was done in May of 1981 and March of 1982, which is illustrated there by those lines with the dots on them. And the initial budget was around, kind of centered around those S-curves. And that's what we call an S-curve. And we talk about risk analysis. We talk about the S-curve because what we're displaying here there's two axes. One is the cost, in this case for cost, and then a confidence level, which is the probability that the final cost will come in at or below the specified amount. So that's what we mean by confidence level. It's not a confidence interval from statistics. It's just a percentile on a cumulative distribution function. So the budget and the initial risk analyses were kind of all down to the lower end of the curve. The final actual cost came in much, much higher. Wasn't even near where the risk analyses were. So we tend to be biased in our risk analyses. We tend to focus on, just like the project does, we tend to be a little bit optimistic. There's numerous biases that influence us when we do initial estimates. And these also affect our estimates of risk and uncertainty. They tend to be too narrow. That's because of the assumptions that are made. We're working for a project office and working for a project. We fall prey to the optimistic assumptions that are made by the project managers and project leadership, which are things like we're going to reuse a lot of existing systems. We're going to adapt a commercial off-the-shelf system, that kind of thing. And that turns out not to be so easy to do. So initially, risk is significantly underestimated. And this is just one example of the tethered satellite system. I collected more data, which I included in my book. We don't have a really good, strong track record on this. We don't tend to look at the past. We need to look at it more often to make sure we are realistic. But I was able to, for a variety of industries, scrounge up 10 data points. And like I talked about the confidence level earlier, that's a percentage or a probability that the actual cost will come in at or below a specified value. So a 90% confidence level would mean 90% of the time, the actual cost would come in at or below what you estimate at that level. So for these 10, I looked at where the final cost, and in one of these cases, the project was canceled, but it still came in above the 90% confidence level initial risk analysis. So you would expect that most of the time that your actual costs would come in at or below the 90% Causal, because 9 times out of 10 it should come in at or below that amount. But if you actually look at it, most of these cases, it comes in at or above it. And that's not good. That's kind of the opposite of what we expect. And so the statistical likelihood of this occurring if your risk analyses are realistic is more remote than the chance that you'll be struck by lightning in the next year, you as an individual. So this says that these risk analyses are probably not very realistic. So how do you cope with that? We talked about why we underestimate risk. One thing is unknown unknowns. There's a lot of things when we do a project we don't know. Donald Rumsfeld was one of the people that made this phrase popular. There's things that we don't know. We go into a project. And that's not exactly the same, but it's kind of related to the idea of black swans. Black swans are improbable and surprising events without a consequence. Well, they're kind of a subset of the unknown unknowns. But and there's some things that you just can't predict in advance. But Norm Augustine, in his classic book, Augustine's Laws, Norm Augustine had years of experience as CEO of Lockheed Martin, and prior to that as a government official with the Army. But he noticed was that if you look at the overall statistics, you can predict them in the aggregate to a large extent. There's some things that are just not predictable, but you can kind of get these in the aggregate, just like actuaries do with calculating life insurance premiums. They look at a large group of population and how they fluctuate, and they look at the past. A lot of those unknown unknowns are sort of embedded in there. We just can't necessarily delineate them or articulate them going forward for a project. So, and the way to handle on this these unknown unknowns is to look at historical cost growth and schedule delay data. And this is a very common problem. So the histogram on the right is basically for 289 DoD and NASA projects that I collected several years ago, and you see that the bulk of the projects have, and the most common outcome, if you look at the bins, is for there to be 0 to 25% cost growth. And hey, that's pretty good. So we're within a quarter of that. But look at all the cases where you're above that. In many cases, you're more than double. So 100% means you doubled or more. Look at the cases that are 200%. There's quite a few cases where you more than triple the cost. And originally, when I wrote my book, initial draft was focused on aerospace and defense, which is my background. And to publish it, McGraw-Hill asked me to look at all projects. I want to make it applicable to all sorts of projects. So I found pretty quickly that the same things that I had discovered for aerospace and defense applied to all types of projects. So the graph below is a summary of cost growth and schedule delay data for all sorts of industries. And I found that NASA and Department of Defense it's not the worst at all. Software IT is actually as bad or worse in some respects. And the Olympics, at least for cost growth, the Olympics is the worst of all. Think about the different things that go into that, the international planning, and the fact that there tends to be a fixed schedule. So in my data is all pre-COVID cost growth and schedule delay data. And if you look at that, there's a 0% chance of schedule delay for Olympics. That's what had occurred in the past. But then COVID came along, and there was a year delay in the Summer Olympics that was planned for 2020, which actually happened last year in 2021. So you see this occurs for all types of projects, no matter what kind of industry you work in. This is a common phenomenon. And one of the things I like to think about in terms of getting my handle around the frequency that a project will double in cost or more. How often does that occur? Roads is kind of on the low end. There's 1 in 50, so it's not as risky. But software and IT, 1 in 4. 1 out of 4 projects doubles or more in cost. Depending on which data sets you look at, and there are different ways to slice and dice the data. Oxford professor Van Fluberg has looked at this problem for 1,000 projects, and he found that about 1 in 6 more than triples in cost in terms of software and IT projects. So extreme cost growth is not uncommon, and this is what really makes it hard to get our hands around in terms of getting a good feel for the risk, in terms of good intuition about the risk. But the way to kind of get around this issue is you think about historical cost growth and schedule delay data. Those are instances where risks have occurred in the past. So that's risk, it's risk in action, risks that have occurred. It's actual evidence of risk. So it's a little bit of archaeological evidence that risk has occurred. And if you think about the cost growth data, you can actually fit that to a log normal distribution. Fits a 3-parameter log normal quite well. Does not fit a Gaussian, which is another name for the normal. And as I like to say, the normal is not so normal when it comes to the work that we do. If you look at schedule delay data, same sort of thing. It's a little bit more jagged because I don't have many data points, but it fits the log normal very well, much more closely than a normal distribution. So you can use these kinds of tools and look at this historical data to calibrate your risk analyses and make them realistic. So this amount, as long as you know the amount of this historical growth will give you an idea about the amount of variation. If you have an estimate for a cost or schedule, you can then decide, okay, based on the source of the data, you can decide where does that fit on the S-curve. It could be an average, it could be the mean, it could be the most likely value, it could be some percentile. For example, if it's just a simple point estimate, riskless estimate of cost or schedule, then it could be at a very low level, because you look at the data, 80-90% of these projects overrun in costs. So it could be a 20% or a 10% confidence level. And then you just gotta need a sense also of how low can you go, like how much can you underrun and still have a project that resembles what you initially started with. That often is somewhere between 50 and 100%, depending on the type of project. Also, I like to talk about information technology in particular. We talked about how it is one of the riskiest types of projects, and in terms of the things that commonly occurs, it is kind of, you think, well, it's the riskiest kind of common project that we come across. Information technology is an increasingly important aspect of all projects. The Internet of Things. Think about that. Everything that you look at is being connected to the Internet. It's got software in it, embedded in it. Recently bought a house, and now I can, every time I open my garage door, I get a notification on my phone that my garage door has been opened or closed. It's kind of good in a way, kind of irritating another way. But you also see this with roads. You talk about roads being the simplest type of project in some ways and the least risky. But now you look at, they're starting to embed sensors in roads to measure things like temperature and how much moisture and how much rain. So there's even things such as smart roads, and the roads are being connected to the internet. So those kinds of things. So you've got everything's becoming increasingly IT centric and IT focused. So all types of projects are becoming increasingly risky in that regard. And I'm talking about some examples of some IT projects that have not gone too well in terms of cost growth and schedule delays. The Phoenix Federal Pay System, healthcare.gov, the Denver Airport Baggage System, and the Fox-Meyer Enterprise Resource Planning System. Phoenix Federal Pay System incorporated COTS elements, but commercial off the shelf. It was intended to save money. A bug in the system underpaid civil servants and cost billions to fix. Actually, one of my first jobs out of graduate school was working for a software company trying to integrate a geometric commercial off-the-shelf software into a computer-assisted design software system. And it was so difficult to get it to work efficiently that basically that particular project wound up getting canceled. So you can see that IT projects, can be very difficult. You think that the idea was using the COTS system, it would save them time and money in developing the project, and wind up sort of ruining the project in that sense. Healthcare.gov, that's the Obamacare website. That is an agile project. So people think of agile, which is agile as doing things and breaking things down into small individual sorts of pieces and trying to break things down, make them simpler. It tends to work pretty well, especially in terms of handling risk for software. You tend to do things incrementally. You get one thing, work in these little sprints, you get things done, sort of incrementally build up the capability. It tends to work really well, but it's not a Band-Aid. So healthcare.gov was an actual project that didn't work out so well. The system was rolled out before it was ready. A lot of technical issues. They didn't expect the number of people that were going to sign in or try to use the system, so it wasn't designed to handle the number of users that logged in, trying to use the system, and it required billions of dollars to fix as a result. The Denver Airport Baggage System, so if you look at the Denver Airport now, it's a huge airport. The initial plans for that airport included an automated baggage handling system, very software intensive. But they had a lot of poor planning. They waited till the last minute to try to start the project, did not give themselves enough time. It was very complex to do this. And that project in and of itself delayed the new airport's opening, and it's costing the local government millions of dollars a month, because of these delays. It was ultimately canceled. It was actually implemented in one small part of the airport, but it actually was less efficient and took more time to process the luggage than the manual tug and pull type system that was used before. Another example is Fox Meyer, which used to be a $5 billion pharmaceutical wholesale giant in the 1990s. And they had a legacy system that was becoming obsolete. They had to do something to implement this new system. And it wasn't going too well. And rather than trying to stop and say, okay, what's going wrong here? What do we need to do? They just sort of doubled down. They went all in, and they actually went bankrupt trying to implement the system and went out of business. So IT projects can bring down a company. And so IT projects, how risky are they? Talked about the 3-parameter log normal. There's a 3-parameter log normal does fit. One measure of IT risk is think about software code, lines of code in a software project. How much does it grow? There have been various studies that have done that. This is looking at software code growth for over 100 Department of Defense projects. And it does fit a 3-parameter log normal very well. But there's some evidence. I mentioned Bent Fluberg's study that said 1 out of 6 IT projects triples the warning cost. So there's some evidence that it's actually really risky, even riskier than a 3-parameter log normal could potentially model. And that's where we get into the extreme value. So if you get into really extreme risks, then there's a different set of tools to look at that are sort of related to something called extreme value theory. And so Abraham Maslow said, I suppose it's tempting that the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. And that's, in this case, if you were to use your traditional statistical tool bag, which is focused on what's the mean, what is the average? What is the standard deviation? Well, looking at the extremes, those things don't necessarily matter. Not all problems involve estimating a best value. Example is, what is the fastest time a human being has run a marathon? What is the fastest time a human being has run a mile? What is the longest long jump that anyone's done in the Olympics or in any kind of competitive track and field type of event? You're looking at the extremes. What is the biggest flood that has occurred in the Netherlands? Those are not estimating a best value. Those are estimating a maximum value. What is the maximum? You can also look at a minimum value. But estimating extreme values requires a different tool set. There's a variety of different statistical tools to analyze those things. And I also want to just kind of reiterate that the mean is not always meaningful. Like NASA and Taleb talks about two different countries, or theoretical ideas of countries. One is mediocristan, which is where things like if you look at the lifespan of humans, the heights of humans, those things kind of tend to follow a normal distribution. Those are the kind of things that traditional statistics is designed to estimate. The other type of land is called extremistan, where many events experience extreme fluctuations, and they may not be meaningful to even talk about a standard deviation. It could be the case that as you collect more data, standard deviation continues to grow and grow. Benoit Mandelbrot, who's a mathematician who coined the term fractal, worked in chaos and fractals, and fractal geometry was kind of his key contribution. He looked at financial data in the 1960s, and he found that the more data that he collected in terms of the variation, the more the standard deviation continued to grow. So it gave some indication that there was no finite variance when you looked at some financial data like that. He actually pointed this out to the financial community and the finance professors, and they kind of tried to look at it a little bit, and then they wound up abandoning it because it was so much easier to deal with standard statistical tools. And they tended to work some of the time. The problem is the extreme cases, but they don't work. So the statistics are extreme. You're trying to estimate a maximum value of some set, x1 through xn, or some minimum value. And these kind of things tend to follow power laws in the tails rather than normal distribution. So a normal distribution would tail off, maybe kind of have very minimal tail. But the power laws are things that if you plot them on a log scale, so log scale is things that vary by order of magnitudes. These things tend to follow a straight line. That indicates that those extreme values that are out there, they're relatively rare, but they occur fairly regularly. Here's a practical example of that. The power outages in Texas in 2021. It was high impact. Millions of people without power at one point during the winter, during the coldest part of the winter, some temperatures below 0 degrees in Texas. It's not common, but something similar occurred in Texas 10 years before. So they had some foreknowledge that these things could happen. If you look at if you look at it from a causal perspective, what are the things that could cause it to happen? Snow and ice could do things like freeze up. Texas has done a pretty good job of trying to invest in renewable sources of energy, but these things can be unreliable at times, such as wind turbines. Well, it gets very cold, and you don't design the system to work in extreme cold. These things can not function at the critical time, and you can be without power. These things follow power law, and what happened in Texas is not the most extreme. There was an even more extreme event that occurred in the Northeast years ago, but it happened in August, and it was just a few hours. It was a blackout that occurred in the summer because of high demand for air conditioning. No one really died as a result. People were sweated for a little while, but no one really suffered extremely. Another example is flooding. So if you look at the Netherlands with dikes, you see a lot of green areas and a little bit of blue from a little bit of water, quite a bit of water. And if you've been to the Netherlands, there's quite a bit of water, dikes and canals. But without dikes, it would be most of the country would be underwater. And what the Netherlands does is they plan for 1 in 1,000 year events. They don't look at an average. What is the average flood? If they were to plan for an average flood, most of the country would be underwater. So they look more like what's on the right. So they plan for these extremes. So if you know about these kind of extreme things, and these extreme things that could hurt you or even put you out of business, these are things you need to be prepared to cope with. Pandemics is an ongoing extreme event. I've looked at this the last couple of years. Looked at it a year ago. There were 3 million and counting, over 3 million deaths due to COVID. Now there's over 6 million. So you look at what you're looking at there is when you're looking at threshold exceedances again. The x-axis, we're looking at things that vary about orders of magnitude. It's a log plot, and then what percentage of deaths exceed? What is the probability that you will experience more than? And these are historical pandemic data. This is something that NASA and Taleb and Pascal Cirillo looked at in 2020. They looked at Wikipedia data on pandemics, so it's a little bit of a rough data source, but it kind of gives you the right idea. And if you go back to 500 BC, which was kind of the early part of recorded history, and there was the plague of Athens that occurred, and then you bring up to modern day, and as I mentioned, Spanish flu. There's also things that are currently unsolved that have killed millions of people, like HIV. That's kind of another kind of slowly spreading pandemic. And you scale that up for current population. There are a couple of historical plagues that had they occurred in the current environment, and it spread worldwide, could have resulted in over 1 billion deaths. So just something to keep in mind. COVID-19 is sort of in the tail around the 74th percentile. 74, there's 26% of events have been worse than that. So including some that could have killed billions. Now the Black Swan, let's talk about the Black Swan a little bit. Its origin is the Roman satirist Juvenal. He said a rare bird on earth similar to a black swan. It was thought that a black swan didn't exist until they were discovered in Australia. They've come to mean, in sort of common parlance, rare events, things that don't occur very often, but that are high impact. There's another aspect to that, though. And if you look at Nassim Taleb's book, he really focuses on the rare but high impact, but kind of between the fine lines and what people have talked about academically is what Taleb means by a black swan is something that's surprising, something that you can't predict. So there's, but the term black swan is going to mean rare but high impact events. Well, some of those you can predict. Some of those you cannot. So you can predict, what the potential consequence can be, and then you can prepare for that consequence. But there are some things that will catch you off guard no matter what you do in advance. So is COVID-19 a black swan? It is high consequence. It's fairly rare. We haven't seen a pandemic like this in some time. Was it improbable? There's a couple of writers that have written about this. One of which is Nassim Taleb in the Black Swan. He wrote that, the history of epidemics does not suggest the risks of the Great Plague that will come to dominate the planet someday. COVID-19, with millions of deaths, probably not something that dominated the planet, but it has dominated headlines quite a bit, and it has hurt a lot of people. In addition to killing people, it's also injured people and damaged their health. But Nassim Taleb kind of said that this was something that could happen, and also he cited that one of the things that could cause it to happen in the future is an increase in global travel. As people around the world have gotten richer, if you've seen like rising incomes in China, for example, and other places that used to be third world countries, these folks are traveling internationally. So there's a lot more international travel by global citizens. And then Laurie Garrett, who's an expert on pandemics, she wrote in 2000 that there will be, because whatever medical advances we make, there will still always be these diseases that we can't prevent, and there will be something like this occur in the future. And she also cited global travel as a factor in that. Okay, here's an example of something that's currently ongoing in terms of some fluctuations is economic uncertainty. The S&P 500 in 2022. So I think just yesterday or today I read that that the stock market has from its peak has dropped 20%. So it's entered the bear market. So is it a black swan though? I mean, it's high impact. I mean, you think about if you're trying to retire in the next few years, and a lot of your retirement is in the stock market. You need to be careful. But it's high impact. But these things occur pretty regularly. I mean, we see drawdowns in the stock market, and we see bear markets from time to time. What's going to happen from here? I don't know. It could go down more. It could turn around and go up. Another article today that said that people that once you enter a bear market, people that then buy more stock, the stock that they buy, tends to go up on average 20%, over 20% in the next year. So when stock prices come down, it's usually typically a good time to buy. It's just a matter of when do you buy, because it doesn't always turn around. Think about the Great Depression, and hopefully we're not anywhere near a situation like that, because we are still seeing strong economic growth, very low unemployment, but we are seeing a dropping stock market. It's also something that would be unpredictable. You can kind of foresee it in a certain extent that things have been relatively overvalued by a variety of measures for some time. Just my own personal account, I got one of my accounts I'm working with a financial advisor on. I went kind of underweighted stocks about a year ago because I looked at a Tobin skew ratio, and the stock market did pretty well last year, so I missed out on some gains. And now my portfolio was actually more heavily weighted in stocks just due to capital gains than what I intended. But one of the things you can do is there are other things out there besides stocks to invest in. There's bonds, there's commodities, there's if you don't want to necessarily invest in a commodity directly through futures, which can be risky. You can there's gold mining companies, there's oil companies, things like that. If you want to, a big part of that is diversification. Trying to that applies to the stock market, applies to the economy in general. If you have a company that is potentially prone to a specific risk, diversifying so that when one potential source of revenue may go out, another source to rely on. Diversification is very important in a variety of areas. If you look at the stock market data, if you look at monthly losses since 1981, April was actually a very bad month in the stock market, 10% decline. If you actually look at that, there are several data points that had monthly losses in excess of 10%, which is this area, these dots here that are on, they're blue dots that are on the curve and actually below the power law that's predicted there. And they are a little bit less likely to occur than the power law, but they are pretty significant. And that April drawdown is right there. It's one that's like the fourth worst since 1980. So in that regard, inflation is very high. And this is more headlines have occurred since I put this chart together. We're at a 40-year high in terms of inflation. March was a 40-year high, and then I think May was hit another high since 1980. It's not a black swan either. I mean, these are kind of things that occur. We've been seeing this coming for a while, I think. I mean, when will it kind of ameliorate? There's a couple of different things that are going on. There's some of it's pent-up demand from the COVID pandemic because people get out and about more. But then that should abate at some point. But then you also have the war in Ukraine, which is affecting food prices. So who knows when that's going to end? We don't. It's a lot of uncertainty about that. So but we've benefited from low inflation for a long period of time, low interest rates. Now you're seeing higher interest rates. Mortgage rates are going up. My utility bills going up. So we're seeing this impacting us in a lot of ways. Investing in commodity stocks may be a way to kind of hedge against some of this. Gold mining companies and oil companies is one potential way. I'm not a financial advisor. This is not financial advice by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the ways you kind of can cope with risk is one of the ways is to diversify. And things like gold stocks and oil stocks are things that tend to rise as inflation goes up. Another zoological metaphor for risk is the dragon king, which is going beyond the power laws, which are one of the things is nuclear power plant radiation release. That's kind of scary. There are things that when you get down to the very, the worst examples, they tend to be outside the range of what is predicted by a power law. So a power law was this in this graph on the left, the nuclear power range and nuclear power release. The radiation release is that straight line. And then the very worst examples are these X's, and they're outside of these power laws. This power law is predicted. So the very worst ones are actually worse than a power law. That's called a dragon king. Another example, more innocuous, is the biggest cities in the world. Things like London, Mexico City, Paris. They are outside what is predicted by a power law. Most of the city sizes tend to follow a power law pretty well, but the very biggest cities tend to fall to the right of that. So Dragon Kings was coined by the physicist Didier Sornet. He kind of coined this in response to the Black Swan because he said there's some things that are outside what's predicted by a power law. They're massive. They're high impact risks, and they arise from unique origins. They can be predicted to some extent, but they could require some complex physical modeling. And there's things that you have to kind of pay careful attention to, but it could have a good payoff, like nuclear radiation release. Those are things that you would really want to try to pay attention to and try to mitigate. Okay, another type of tool to deal with rare events that have high impact are Bayesian decision networks. Correlation is the tendency of two random variables to tend to move together. Things like shark attacks and ice cream sales at the beach. Well, one doesn't cause the other, but they both tend to occur in the summer when there are more people at the beach. And the more people at the beach, the more people get attacked by sharks because there are more people in the water to be attacked by sharks. There's however, an underlying factor, which is the climate, which is summertime, more people are at the beach. Causation looks at, one thing that causes another. What are the things that factor into a phenomenon being caused by something else? It's a relatively new sort of thing. Is the idea arose around 100 years ago, and there's something called structural equation modeling. There are some tools for that. More recent is some Bayesian decision networks that have been pioneered by Judea Pearl, who has won major awards in the field of computer science for his work in this. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So we talked about correlation, talked about causation. The causal framework can help with understanding what is going on. Risk management is all about understanding the context. It's relatively new. So the Book of Why is a good general audience book about the science of cause and effect. He's got some more technical books on this as well. It goes back to Bayes' theorem. So here's one example of equation that Reverend Thomas Bayes developed, which is conditional probability. And it's just a framework for thinking about this. And here's an example of, if you look at, there was a Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh, in conjunction with the Software Engineering Institute. There are thought leaders in this. They developed tools for this. There's a freely available tool called Tetrad, T-E-T-R-A-D, that you can download, I think from the University of Pittsburgh website, that will enable you to do this kind of analysis. And so here's an example of a Software Engineering Software Engineering Institute project that was done with Carnegie Mellon on factors that determine software project success. And you will see that things that can cause quality to suffer, arrows can move in multiple directions, but the idea was just things that predict, when quality will suffer, and the way that the tools work. Missed and late decisions, for example, can cause quality to suffer. That's pretty obvious kind of thing. Unclear goals can cause quality to suffer. The arrow moves in both directions because you look at the data and you look at the relationship. It looks like one can cause the other, but that's kind of the way that the math works out with that. And also I'll talk a little bit about moving beyond quantification. Risk management is more than just about, we want to try to quantify and estimate and analyze risk. And I've touched on 3 different tools that we can use to do that. The 3 parameter log normal, which is you can use at sort of a relatively low level or a very high level. I've talked about extreme value theory, and I've talked about Bayesian decision networks. The Bayesian decision networks are used in the intelligence community, for example, because you're looking at rare events that have limited amounts of historical precedence. Great thing about the Bayesian decision network, it allows you to incorporate both objective data and subjective experience. You get all sources of, basically all your sources of data can be incorporated. But then there's some things you need to kind of go beyond quantification, and you need to think forward. Here's an example of the gray rhino. Common risk in plain sight we ignore. This term was inspired by financial crises in Argentina and Greece. Like I said earlier on, you can see the rhino coming from quite a ways away because it's very big. If you've ever been to the zoo and seen a rhino, they tend to be fairly placid. They're over there munching on the grass. They're moving very slowly. But once they start running, they can run very fast, like on order of like around 40 miles an hour. So once they start coming at you, you're not going to outrun them. There's quite a few examples of this that have occurred. Climate change, to some extent, is something that's plain sight that we're ignoring. Another risk that's in plain sight that we're ignoring is, the national debt. For example, we're deeply in debt as a country, so the government's deeply in debt. So those are things that are coming. We don't tend to do much about them, but they are coming. Okay, and then also we need to look forward. So here's an example of something where people look forward a little bit. They should have done more. In 2021, the Ever Given, which is part of the Evergreen Shipping Company. So this is a photo of the Ever Given container ship. It's owned by the Evergreen Shipping Company. It got stuck in the Suez Canal, and it completely blocked all travel through that, or all commerce through that channel for several days. It's about 10% of global trade goes through the Suez Canal, so that has a pretty big impact. Now, if you look at historically, how many ships had completely blocked the Suez Canal? The answer is 0. Never happened. Very small number had caused any kinds of delays. Partially had gotten stuck in the channel and caused any kind of delays. None had ever completely blocked the channel before. The government of Egypt had done some work, spent several $billion in widening parts of the channel, but not all of it. So this is the kind of thing you can see coming. It's high impact, but it hasn't been that bad in the past. Like, well, it never really has happened in the past. But these are the kinds of things that we need to kind of think about when you're looking at risk management. Think about some metaphor. What are the things that could really hurt my business? What are the things that can really hurt my project? And try to prepare for them. And there's 2 sorts of, think about risk management in action. There's 2 things that you can do. There's a whole saying about, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, and give me the courage to change the things that I can. Changing the things you can is, doing some active steps. That's risk mitigation. So, going out and changing a design, selecting a design that will help you risk-proof a project, but making things more resilient, adding redundancy. Think about most avionics systems in spacecraft have some level of redundancy to help mitigate those kinds of risks. The other is reserves. And so that's where you need to have some money set aside. You need to have some sort of tolerance built in for these things happening. Example, you look at the space launch. Back in the 1960s when they were developing the Apollo project, the folks that were designing the actual structures and the overall system, they said, well, they went to the engineers and said, well, we're going to be bigger. They went to the propulsion engineers, people that were developing the rockets that were going to boost these. Said, well, we're going to be 10% bigger than what we initially thought. And they said, well, the propulsion engineers who were German rocket scientists that had many of which had immigrated after World War II. Came over with Werner von Braun. They said, well, we've already accounted for that. We included some reserves in our capability to account for a larger system. We didn't design for the expected weight of the system. We designed for something that was 20% larger, and so we can handle this change. They didn't tell them that up front, which is kind of a smart thing to do, because they told them that up front, they would have not tried to make it as small as possible. So that helped the efficiency a little bit. So you have to be careful in terms of relaying your reserves. You want good communication in a project, but sometimes you don't necessarily want everyone to know about what kind of reserves you have. So two things you can do with risk management: you can try to mitigate, or you can set aside reserves to handle them. And in the case of the Evergreen and something blocking the Suez Canal, mitigation is really the main thing that's there. The country of Egypt did try to do some reserve type work in a way of trying to widen the channel so that it would less likely to happen, but it got stuck in the part that wasn't widened yet. Okay, so some concluding thoughts on this. What are the things you can do to manage black swan risk? So we talked about some things you can do. So one thing you need to think about is what really is black swan. Black swans are things that are rare and high impact. If they are predictable, then try to quantify them, try to predict them. Many of the things that are called black swans really are somewhat predictable. So you have to be careful and make sure if it's really a black swan or not. Black swans are also surprising. So the better prepared you are, the less likely you are to be surprised. Brainstorm potential risk. Are you surprised because the risk could not have been foreseen, or are you surprised because you just didn't think through what could happen? Brainstorm potential risks on a project and discuss how to handle them. And don't just do it up front. As the project evolves, continue to do it. Do it over and over again. Risk management is also about context. Choosing simpler solutions that can help avoid risk. Here's an example. This is actually an urban legend. It's called the space spin example. So when some NASA astronauts were talking to some Russian cosmonauts, they were showing off their fancy space pen. They said, look, we can look at these pens we got. These pens will work in low gravity environments. We can ride in space. And the cosmonauts replied, oh, that's great. We use a pencil. Now that joke kind of being, the urban legend is that NASA spent millions of taxpayer dollars developing a space pen when they could have been using a pencil. And they weren't just using any kind of pencil, because graphite can be flammable. They were using grease pens. And so the idea there, and the kind of moral of the story is, why do something complicated when you can choose something simple? So one way to try to avoid these kind of black swan risks is to choose simple designs, things that are proven to work. When you can. You can't always avoid that. People give NASA a lot of grief compared to SpaceX. Well, NASA is trying to advance, in many cases, they're trying to advance the state of the art. They're trying to advance science. They are trying to, they are very cutting edge, whereas SpaceX is launching people into space, which is not necessarily an easy problem, but it's been done before. But they're not always trying to, advance things. Same thing with the military. Hypersonics is very difficult, but hypersonics are missiles and I think it was airplanes, right? They can fly 5 times faster than the speed of sound, or more. If you've seen the movie, the movie Top Gun Maverick, the new Top Gun movie. In the film, Tom Cruise is a pilot, and he's piloting a hypersonic vehicle that is going 10 times the speed of sound. And then, so it's an interesting example of that kind of project. But so it's very difficult. It's very cutting edge, very state of the art, and we as a country are trying to hurry up and catch up with some of our competitors in China and Russia, because we're behind the curve on that. So, but sometimes you can't avoid doing something complicated. But when you can, do something simpler and not have you avoid risk. Limit your project to one miracle at a time. The Lockheed Skunk Works, this was kind of their motto, was they did things sort of incrementally. So they don't try to advance the state of the art in multiple areas. They would do something with a project. They were known for doing things relatively cheaply and very quick. Start with something that you know how to do, make one change, advance one piece of technology, and then start with that. Now you got this advanced technology, now it's proven technology. Advance something else. Do it step by step. I think a bad example of trying to advance state of the art, NASA's James Webb Space Telescope, which had multiple miracles that had to occur in one project. As a result, the project, how you looked at the starting point of when it's actually going to cost, you can argue that it increased in cost by an order of magnitude, and it cost decades to complete. So it's very difficult to try to do that. Don't do that. That you set yourself up for experiencing more risk. The longer the project, for example, the more risk you could encounter, because things can happen over that period of time. Try to do shorter projects, but on the other hand, you don't want to try to compress it too much, because haste makes waste. The old saying, haste makes waste. Try to do things too quickly, you're going to make mistakes. You may deliver something that doesn't work. But try to do things in too long a period of time, you subject yourself to more risks over that period of time. So that's, try to use agile approaches, which are incremental, which will allow you to do things in a relatively short amount of time, complete something relatively simple, complete that, you're done, and do something else, et cetera, et cetera. And that applies not just software and IT, it also applies to, hardware type projects like I talked about, Skunk Works. And then this is the other thing that NASA talks about in a separate book from the Black Swan called Anti-Fragile, which there's different kinds of projects. There's fragile projects. Many of the projects, especially the government that you work on, are fragile. There's many different moving parts. There's a extensive supply chain. Many of these vendors are very unique. Mom and pop shops. These things are very fragile. Any small change can have a large ripple effect. We need to try to make projects robust to these kinds of things, not just robust, but things that are anti-fragile things that when something happens and some risk occurs, the system actually can potentially get stronger. So, you should look at the book if you're interested in this idea. Look at NASA anti-fragile. It can be kind of hard to make things anti-fragile, but at least as a framework, start thinking about that. And some of the key takeaways that we talked about are, conduct a quantitative risk assessment of cost and schedule. Ensure you're realistic. Calibrating to 3 parameter log normal is going to do that. And that is the tool that I've developed. And if you want my help, Galrath can help you with that. For extreme events, manage with outliers in mind. Try to think about those events that can sink your project or your business, and then try to protect against those. Try to do things. Either set aside reserves or try to do something active, or do some planning up front, and try to choose things that are robust to those kinds of things. Think outside the box. Think about, consider risks that have never occurred in the past. The captain of Titanic is famous for saying that, he'd never seen a ship in trouble or a ship sink before, and that occurred right before the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank. So just because something hasn't occurred in the past or hasn't occurred in your experience doesn't mean it won't. Something likely will go wrong. And risk management is a process. It needs to be done continually throughout a life cycle, throughout the life of a project. Face up to risks and do not ignore them. The other metaphor we talk about in terms of zoological metaphors for risk is the ostrich, which buries its head in the sand and tries to ignore a problem until it goes away. You can't succeed when it comes to risk management by doing that. And all too often projects tend to do that. They kind of bury their heads in the sand by not thinking about what needs to be done. They focus on what's happened, their optimistic assumptions and what's happened in the past. Another key thing that I would also mention, in addition to these four, is try to get some critical viewpoints for your projects, independent viewpoints. One of the ways that you can kind of narrow your focus and not consider all the risk is by not getting into getting some groupthink. You need independent viewpoints and critical viewpoints that can throw rocks at your project in the sense of, can point out things that could go wrong, then you should listen to those. And if you want for more on this topic, and one of the things I talk about in particular in my book is the 3-parameter log normal and resource risk, and how to do that. Doing risk analysis right is difficult. My book talks about some ways to do it correctly. If you want to know more about black swans, the classic book on this is The Black Swan by Ness and Powell. And then if we go to the Q&A section here, if you have questions, you can look at galrath.com. I'll be glad to also engage with you and answer any questions you have after this as well. And now we're going to have time to open up for Q&A during this webinar.
All right, great. Thank you, Dr. Smart. Before we dive into the live Q&A session, I want to let everyone know that we have dropped a link to the post-event survey in the chat. So take a moment and visit that when we're finished here. Also, the PDF version of today's presentation will be available at the end of that 2-minute post-event survey. And I guess we're ready to have you submit your questions using the Q&A button. I'll go ahead and open up the live session for questions. All right. Okay, so the first one we have is a kind of a 2-part question. What % of risk management is focused on the leader's operational preparedness behind the scenes? And what % is the training and development of employees for purposes of equipping them to prevent risks?
I think those are both critical parts. I think training people to actually analyze the risk and do the risk is actually the easy part. Getting behind the scenes and getting leadership to adopt it is the harder part. So in terms of the effort involved, I would say 80% for the former and 20% for the latter.
Okay, great. As an IT leader, what should I be doing to prepare my infrastructure for a Black Swan event?
That's a good question. And you think about IT risks. What are some of the IT risks that are out there? There's a lot of cyber risks. Cybersecurity is very important. Doing some brainstorming on what are the things that could go wrong in terms of the companies or the IT infrastructure's cyber security, and trying to make sure that is secure is very important. And focus on the cybersecurity is a big part of that. Doing some brainstorming on what could go wrong. What are the things what are the things that we have seen go wrong? What are some things that we haven't seen go wrong that could occur? Just look at your project and look at what's gone wrong in the past and try to get some outside critical viewpoints.
Okay, thank you. Risk, cost times probability. Risk of rare events are Nicholas Taub's favorite subject. The best he could offer is to avoid a blow up. What's different here today?
Okay, so I talked about 4 different categories of risk. We talked about the mild risk on one extreme and the intractable risk on the far extreme. And I like Taub a lot, and the Black Swan's a great book, but he tends to focus on trying to make out that so much risk is intractable. You can't really foresee it coming. When the true Black Swans are relatively rare. They occur. They're relatively rare, and they're important to look at. But his focus is on things you can't measure. That's what you're saying. I think what you're saying with don't try not to blow up, which is basically, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Another more practical aspect of his recommendation is to diversify. But in terms of the rare extreme events, there are a lot of things you can predict, and you can look at the unknown unknowns by calibrating that to historical risks that have occurred in the past. The examples I gave were cost growth and schedule delays. You can, for extreme events that can occur, that you can look at extreme value theory. And then there are some things that may not have much precedence. These things have not really occurred much in the past. Then Bayesian belief networks is another tool set, and causal modeling is another tool set for getting your head around and analyzing extreme risk. So there's a lot of things, tools that you can use out there to model extreme risk. The Black Swan is very good at pointing out that there's a lot of risk out there. Some of it we can't measure, but there's a lot that we can do, a lot we can measure in a practical sense. My emphasis on risk is more on the practical side in terms of measuring and managing risk concretely. Taleb he has some background in financial risk as a trader on the floor and in doing some empirical trading and fund management. But a lot of his kind of flows over to the academic side, which is they tend to focus a lot on measurable and immeasurable uncertainty. There is some of that out there, but it's just like that. Well, you can't really measure it, so just try to make sure you don't risk everything all at once. So you go out of business, potentially. Black Swan knocks you out of business. But there's a lot of things that you can do. There's a lot of tool sets out there that you can use to manage extreme risk.
Very good. Okay, one more question I have here is, what are a few considerations or what steps should we be taking to protect data storage and security?
Well, I mean, data storage security, so cybersecurity is a large part of that. There's some aspects of, the Internet of Things. There's a lot of where everything's getting connected to the Internet, but don't connect everything to the Internet. Some of the data storage limit its connectivity. Don't try to cut it off so that if it's not connected to the Internet, someone from outside the country can't hack into it.
What's the difference between risk and uncertainty?
So we talked about just a minute ago. I talked about kind of this academic idea of measurable versus immeasurable uncertainty, and their definition is uncertainty is, and that's kind of the economics profession, and Taleb kind of follows in that realm to some extent, is uncertainty are things that you can't measure, and risks are the things you can quantify. But my definition, that's more of a practical definition, is uncertainty is the indefiniteness about an outcome, and this goes back to Paul Garvey. Uncertainty is an indefiniteness about an outcome. It's the good things that can happen, the opportunities for savings on a project, as well as the risks that costs will increase, for example. And risks are the bad things that can happen. So the risks that costs could increase on the project.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, if anybody has any other questions, you can type them into the Q&A port. And so we're pretty much ready to wrap up then. So I just want to take a moment, thank everybody for attending today. And please remember to click on the exit survey link in the chat window where you can provide feedback on today's session. You can also suggest topics for upcoming sessions. You'll be able to download today's presentation and also enter to win the $100 Amazon gift card. Also, please check out galarath.com to learn more about the SEER cost optimization platform. And I'll keep the webinar window open for another minute so you can have time to access those links. And the survey link will also be emailed to you if you've missed it. And thank you again, Dr. Smart, and thank you everybody for attending, and have a wonderful day.